Hi, I'm Alicia.
And I'm Robin, and you're listening to Bowel Moments,
the podcast sharing real talk about the realities of IBD. Served on the rocks.
This week we talked to Kim Brawley. Kim is a registered dietitian who specializes in inflammatory bowel disease. She's in virtual private practice right now, seeing kids and adults living with IBD. She's also a consultant on nutrition and IBD-related research studies, IBD nutrition program development, and she educates practitioners on nutritional therapy for inflammatory bowel disease. Previous to that, she was with Seattle Children's Hospital's IBD Center. We talked to her about what it's like to develop research programs around nutrition therapies and how difficult that can be. We talked to her about health disparities and nutrition programs. We talked to her about the specific carbohydrate diet and the CDED diet. We talked to her about the website she developed with a patient named Maddie called Eats for IBD, which is a database that helps you find recipes for specific diets for inflammatory bowel disease. And we talked to her about what it's like to be in private practice after being part of a hospital system. We think you're going to love Kim as much as we did. Cheers!
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Bowel Moments. This is Robin.
Hey, guys. This is Alicia, and we are absolutely so excited to be joined by Kim Brawley. Kim, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Alicia and Robin, for having me. It's an absolute joy to be here.
Well, you say that, but you haven't actually gotten through the episode with us yet, so you may change your mind, but we'll see. We'll see. Sure. We'll check back in at the end. But first question for you, which is our very unprofessional question of what are you drinking?
Well, I wish it could be a little more exciting, but I'm getting over the flu. The only thing that sounded good was this mango lemon Spindrift that I've never tried before.
Ooh, yummy. I love Spindrift.
A Frozen Princess mug.
Perfect. That's perfect.
Yes.
Robin, what about you?
I am drinking something just as exciting, maybe even less exciting. Hot water with lime. Water with lime. And I have a tree mug.
That's a very pretty mug. Yeah, I like that.
Fun fact, everyone. I love a good handmade coffee mug. I collect coffee mugs.
Okay. Hint taken. Noted.
Exactly.
Are you going to be more fun, Alicia? Are you having a beverage?
Yes, I am drinking an Aperol Spritz. But since I didn't have sparkling wine, it's just sparkling water in there. So it's sparkling. Topo Chico has a whole line of just sparkling waters without the alcohol, guys, but it's flavored sparkling waters. So the cans are exactly the same as the alcoholic version. So I do have to be careful when I'm grabbing stuff out of the fridge because I'm like, and they're like, oh no, that's the alcohol. This one is clementine and ginger. I know it's the flavors in it. And so I decided we'll take a gamble and see how this is for an Aperol Spritz, quote unquote. So it's pretty good, but this is not about my absolute adoration of Topo Chico. Although we're not sponsored by, just going to put it out there that we would love to be. But it is about you. So Kim, next question for you is tell us about yourself. What brought you into our IBD community?
Well, like many, I kind of found my way to IBD. I studied at UC Davis and did my internship there. And I worked long-term on the GI floor. And long-term being like months of staff relief. We were placed on certain floors, so I was stuck and fell in love with GI. And I followed during that time a young teenage patient with severe Crohn's disease and malnutrition. And like many individuals, I had no clue what inflammatory bowel disease was at the time. But I did see that this kid was really sick and we really had to go to bat for their nutrition and to get him to a point where we could kind of rehab his nutrition status, and then eventually he went to surgery. So this experience, I don't know if it was the relationship with the patient or just the integral part that nutrition had in his journey, impacted me greatly. And I developed a deep compassion for those living with IBD. And then after my internship, my now husband proposed, which required a move to Seattle. And I joined the amazing Seattle Children's GI group and was invited to partner with their multidisciplinary team to help grow their nutrition program as the IBD dietitian. And this role involved inpatient and outpatient nutrition care for the very early onset IBDers to those transitioning to adult care. And it included teaching GI fellows and fellow dietitians, mentoring other colleagues, teaching, sharing about nutrition and IBD, both locally and nationally. And I also had the privilege of following patients long-term as they navigated nutrition therapies through research, changes in their medications and their therapy, and also in the perioperative setting. So I kind of followed them everywhere. And through nutrition research and some of these experiences, I learned the intricate role that nutrition really plays in each stage of disease management, and overall the large knowledge gap of research that's still needed surrounding IBD nutrition. And that was, 12 years ago now, and we've come a long ways, but it's still there.
Yes. Yeah. It, like you said, it really is remarkable how much research has been produced in that amount of time, but also how much we still have to go. And you were part of the setting up of the clinical studies that were going on within the IBD Center as well. Like you were part of the clinical team that was like putting together clinical trials around some of different diet related studies.
Yes, mostly around the specific carbohydrate diet and around exclusive enteral nutrition.
Okay, very cool. Talk to us a little bit more about what's the impetus of starting this as a clinical trial? Was it that there was already like an investigator that had this as an idea, or like at what point did you step in and be like, hey guys, like I have an idea? Like how does this work within a setting like that?
So I think this story is very familiar in that the patients were the ones coming to us at Seattle Children's saying, hey, this diet works. This specific carbohydrate diet has worked for my child. And for those, who may not be as familiar, the specific carbohydrate diet is one nutrition approach to managing IBD that focuses on whole foods, is kind of anti-inflammatory focus. And it also excludes certain foods that may be inflammatory or lead to kind of contribute to intestinal dysbiosis. And so we had an incredible team of two in particular, Dr. Suskin and Dr. Lee, who were very nutrition focused. And they said, okay, well, if this is real, we need to research this because we need the evidence, right, to actually include it in practice. And then being the IBD dietitian there at the time, I said, well, to do an elimination diet safely, we need to know that it is nutritionally complete. As dietitians, our goal is to expand diet and to improve quality of life through food. And so the idea of an elimination diet can be really scary or feel foreign and like something that we don't want to do. So that's kind of how the research started on the specific carbohydrate diet back in, I want to say 2011, 2012.
So after you get your initial results from the study, you're seeing kind of how this is working within your community. Was the next step then to sort of broaden this out outside of your center, or what was the next step?
Yeah, so we decided to partner with the Improve Care Now network, which, combines data from all different pediatric IBD centers. It's an incredible supportive network, and we had an incredible PI and kind of brought together a team to create this first multi-center study looking at the specific carbohydrate diet versus a modified specific carbohydrate diet. So as we saw patients coming in to clinic, we get second opinions from across the country, from, different parts of the world who would come in for a second opinion around nutrition therapy, and at the time, a lot of it was the SCD. And what we were finding is many kids would come in and they would be doing kind of the staging that's outlined in the book, Breaking the Vicious Cycle. And that's kind of where the diet started back in the 1900s by Elaine Gottschall, who pioneered. Her daughter had, benefits from the SCD. So she really started researching it and saying, why does this maybe work? And up until now, or the last 5 to 10 years, we had a lot of anecdotal reports that diet worked. So this first multi-center study, as the patients came in, we said, okay, they're not really getting past 5 foods. So obviously, can this diet be a therapeutic option if we can't expand, to a nutritionally complete diet? We were seeing nutrient deficiencies, kids were losing weight. And so that's really what led the research of kind of the pilot studies that we were looking at Seattle Children's, and then looking at, can we do a broadened version of the SCD so that it's more sustainable for families. So from there, the produce that, brought on this long 5-year adventure of, I think we enrolled around 18 to 20 sites through the Improved Care Now network and up to about 21 patients. And we used a very unique study design called the N of 1 studies, where each patient is their own control and experiment. And then the data that we find from each patient who's enrolled in the study can be aggregated so we can look at the group as a whole. And patients were randomized into either the SCD or the modified SCD. And then they were kind of triggered on a phone application that was designed for the study to switch diet arms after 8 weeks. So they would start on one, like for example, they start on the SCD, and then after 8 weeks, they'd be told to switch to the modified SCD. So my kind of role in that was teaching other dietitians through the center, how do you implement the SCD safely? And how do we ensure nutrition adequacy and growth, for kids? And then we had clear guidelines of what we were monitoring and over what time period. So from that study, we found that, hey, maybe we don't need to start as rigorous as the SCD. Both groups improved on either the SCD and the modified from a symptom standpoint and a pain standpoint, as well as an inflammatory standpoint. So the conclusion was maybe we can start with a more liberalized version. I think practice is different depending on where you're at and the provider's experience with nutrition as therapy.
Now you have all of these other institutions that have trained dietitians.
Yes, that was the best part of it too.
Yeah.
Disseminating the information so that they could, as patients were coming, and especially young patients of parents who really wanted to try a nutrition option.
I'm curious that if within that study, as part of that, were children taken off of any like biologic therapies, or just was it looking at just like kind of that versus steroids, or how interventional did this get for those kids?
Great question. That's a common question we get in practice is, hey, if we start a nutrition therapy, can we come off of medication? This study did not look at that. There were guidelines of what medications the child could be on, and within a certain time frame that they could not have any changes, whether it was steroids or a biologic. So many were on medications. We also looked and included those with both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, which was unique because a lot of the nutrition therapies just look at Crohn's. Up until this point have looked at Crohn's disease, but we didn't go as far as, that was a personal discussion with the team, depending on how each patient did, where they went as far as maintenance or transitioning off of the study protocol.
Okay. Yeah, that was going to be my next question is, did you limit it to a specific disease? So thank you for answering it ahead of that. I'm curious because again, I know people have heard about the specific carbohydrate diet. I always want to see SCD diet. And then I'm like, no, that is like calling an ATM machine. No, Alicia, that's not how it goes. I know folks have heard about SCD or even a modified version of it. Can you talk a little bit more about part of this is is obviously the carbohydrate aspect of this. Can you talk a little bit more in specifics about kind of what is in the diet? Obviously not giving the whole party away, but just giving it kind of like an overview of like, if you're talking to somebody who's considering it, how do you sort of prep them to be like, hey, this is what it's going to be like?
Another super important question. And everyone comes in kind of at a different stage of their knowledge, right? In clinic, how I approached it was a little different than in private practice. So in private practice, we know IBD patients are so savvy. They're so well read. They really know their stuff, which is excellent. So they come in usually having seen my website and say, okay, I want to do this nutrition therapy, unless you tell me otherwise. So we can really hit the ground running. They've seen kind of the ins and outs of the diet. In clinic, it was more of a discussion of, I had the privilege of meeting with or at least had the opportunity to meet with every newly diagnosed patient that went through the hospital. And at the time, I had no clue what a gift that was, now knowing that 25% or so, what did Dr. Binion say in his episode? 25% of patients are seen at an academic center. So less than that are seen by a multidisciplinary team. And I would just broach the topic. Half the time I would see them before they met with their doctor post scope. So I was the first person they might be seeing, just how the flow went that day, or if they were inpatient. And I would say, based on the doctor's findings, you have medication options and there's also nutrition options. So I would just present it to them, plant a seed and leave it at that. They're so overwhelmed with so much information. It was more of, hi, I'm Kim. I'm here for you. We will talk at some point, general nutrition recommendations for IBD, but there are also these therapeutic options too that we do support at Seattle Children's. In private practice now, it's a little bit of a different conversation. So those that come knowing the SCD, we can usually hit the ground running and I don't have to go into the details of the diet. But for those that maybe aren't as familiar with it, we do go through kind of the ins and outs of what it involves. And if they feel that that would be a good fit for them, for their family, for their food preferences, there are certain factors that I look at for an individual to see, would they be a good candidate for the SCD, for example? Does that answer your question?
Would you be willing to tell us what those factors are?
Yes.
Or I was like, is this proprietary information?
No. So this is kind of how I think of nutrition therapy. Like if a patient many patients come, at different stages, right? Especially now that I also see adults in private practice, they may come, losing response to a medication, and they're now interested in including nutrition as part of their treatment. Or someone's newly diagnosed and they say, hey, I just want to look and see if there are other options than jumping to a medication. And then from, a family standpoint, many families will ask if there's a nutrition option before committing their child, long-term to a medication. So kind of this would be the ideal scenario. I look at 4 different aspects. Number one, what's going on with the patient? What is their disease classification? We know the gold standard for a nutrition therapy is exclusive enteral nutrition. And I think you guys have talked about that in previous episodes, so I won't go into detail, but is the patient a good fit for EEN? And if not, would they prefer more of a whole foods diet? The best case scenarios, or the most research, are patients with mild to moderate luminal Crohn's disease. Like that has been kind of the bread and butter of nutrition research, although it's definitely expanding now to like complex disease and in the perioperative setting more and more. The second kind of factor that I look at is the family motivated, and the patient? Do they have the means to change their current eating habits, the resources, and kind of the knowledge to learn a new way of eating using new ingredients? Also, are they using diet as a monotherapy or in conjunction to a medication? I frequently and more often than not, patients are using it in coordination with their medication. I also look at, can they be flexible? Like I'm looking for, ideally a patient would say, I know I probably need medication, or I may need that long term, but I really want to try diet first. Kind of the third aspect that I look at is, what are their food preferences? Do they enjoy whole foods? For kids, especially, they maybe have selective palates. Nutrition therapies do not necessarily work for vegans, for example, or those who are very selective eaters. So, if a kid is like, I only like 3 foods, they have mild to moderate Crohn's disease, they may be a perfect fit for the CD/ED, which uses formula, a certain amount of formula, or exclusive enteral nutrition. If for some kids and some adults as well, like just drinking their nourishment, drinking everything they need through a formula can bring a lot of relief. And then the fourth is, what's the clinical indication? Does a patient need a nutrition therapy as their induction therapy? Maybe as a salvage therapy, they've seen loss of response to a medication. That's a great time to try nutrition therapy. Are they headed towards surgery? I think Kelly Isaacson spoke about using nutrition in the perioperative setting and how it can improve outcomes. There's some great literature also coming out on the benefits, as she mentioned, of enteral nutrition in the perioperative setting. So those are kind of 4 aspects I look at. Based on their answers, or kind of as we dig through, I may say that SCD is a good fit. It may be a different nutrition therapy altogether.
I think all of that is helpful. I also love how kind you are when you're like, they may have selective palates. Yeah, my niece
Don't want to
ate,
label them as a picky eater.
I mean, my niece ate like nothing but hot dogs for like 3 years of her life, literally. And I'm like, of all of the nasty things you could be eating, it's
a thing. It's real.
Gross.
And we all gravitate towards our safe foods when we don't feel well.
I mean, listen, tonight I was like, I don't know what to eat. So I ate peanut butter. So, yep.
I went through that same thing with the flu. What am I going to eat?
One of the questions about the SCD that I was curious about is it has a lot of nuts involved. Like there's nut flours that are used in lieu of wheat flours or other types of flours. There's so many kids that are allergic to nuts. So I have big question marks about this diet every once in a while to be like, how are we not killing children while also healing their guts? I don't know.
Great question. So this is where, we've talked about old news being, you need to be on a low fiber diet lifelong with IBD, right? We know that is actually, don't want to say detrimental, but potentially harmful long-term to our patients and the messaging they've heard for so many years. We know there are certain cases, stricturing disease, fistulizing abscess, more complex disease that may need fiber modifications for a time. But when we started researching 10 years ago, we found, this diet really is high fiber. Like there's nothing low fiber about it. And the goal is to get to the full spectrum of the SCD. The more diverse and the more variety of whole foods we have in the diet, the more diverse the microbiome becomes. And, nutrition therapies over and over have shown that. And so it's very not heavy. It's high fiber. And one of the complaints, I guess, I will frequently hear from kids, especially, is the taste of almond flour over and over, right? right? So that's one of the reasons we looked at a modified version of the SCD through the produce study is, hey, can we include some other grains? Kids were tolerating it so well. It's amazing how, resilient they are. Truly, they're including their intestines. Once they're feeling well, how quickly they can start to incorporate fiber. There is a transition period, and we kind of refer to it as bacteria die-off. Sounds like a trendy word or something like that, but it makes sense to people. So as you increase the fiber and add in whole foods, certain bacteria, the good guys that we want, the beneficial bacteria that can be more depleted in IBD, become more abundant. And then other bacteria that maybe we want less of die or become less abundant because they're not being fueled. And some people will say, my stomach feels weird, but it's not like my Crohn's pain, or it's not my typical symptoms. So there is this transition period of a few weeks that, I set patients up. This can be normal that you may feel a little different, but don't be alarmed unless you're seeing, blood or other symptoms.
That is so wild. How weird. Okay. I find this diet really, really interesting, but I have heard it can be a bit challenging for folks. I'm curious because this, like you said, this study came out in 2011, you said 2012?
We first started researching it then, yeah. But the produce study came out I think we finally published it in 2021.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a 5-year study.
I'm wondering if you've seen a change, because I know I ended up figuring out I have celiac disease when I was 30, and that was a long time ago. I'm not close to 30 anymore, and there was nothing. I mean, it was like the opportunities, the options were expensive. There weren't a lot of them, but I've seen a huge influx of now new products, new things coming out. I'm curious if you're seeing the same thing with the SCD folks. Have you seen kind of the industry step up and be able to provide some ease of this diet?
Yeah, it's amazing. 10 to 12 years ago, starting a practice, the gluten-free diet educations looked so different than they do now. The products, I mean, it's insane, right? The same is true with the SCD. Over the last 10 years, I have just seen a huge increase in kind of, for lack of a better word, quote unquote, clean products, they would advertise them as, or prepackaged options without a lot of food additives, for example. The goal of these nutrition therapies is to really minimize a food in a package, right? But we know they can be great options like frozen veggies without any food additives, foods in a can. So there are some parts of the diet that we're still navigating, or, I go into a discussion for patients that are like, well, what about this canned food? Or what about these nuanced questions that we don't have a great answer for? Well, we do now. Our processing has changed so much. The options are there. So if it's a product that fits the ingredients on the SCD to make it sustainable long-term, families generally tend to start bringing these in. I call companies often because they will frequently change their food label about like the ingredients listed on a product. So it can be disappointing at times, if you've used something for so long, like a chicken broth, for example, that doesn't have any sugar in it. And then all of a sudden they start including maltodextrose or maltodextrin or whatever sugar. It can be disappointing, but then we find a new option. So I think, like now is the time to be trying some of these options. And we have a growing body of evidence to support their use. They're not widely accepted in practice still. And I go into a lot of discussion with patients about the nuanced differences between the diets when we have specific questions like making your own yogurt. Why do we have to make it? What strains are we looking at? And can we get that at the store? Because for some families, just the option to have a store option can make it doable. And we'll talk about like, is this necessary to make the diet successful? So we have a lot of discussions around like, how do we talk about food? How do we make it an option that can be sustainable long-term? It's one thing to do something for 3 months. It's another thing to do it for a year. And then when we talk about growing kids, the discussion changes every year based on what's going on in life, where they're at. Are they going through adolescence? Are they teenagers? Are they going off to college? So the dialogue definitely changes, but there are great products out there to make it more successful and sustainable.
I love how you're talking about how it changes over the years, because you've said several times diet as a therapy. And if you're looking at it as a therapy, it's just like your medical therapies. It is diet as a therapy. So you have to treat it that way. You still have to see your provider, which would be your registered dietitian. You still have to follow up with your medical provider if you're using this diet as your medical treatment option. So could you talk about that a little bit, as far as you're still getting your labs, you're still doing all of these things if your diet is your treatment?
Robin, you're touching on such an important part to this that I think this is one of the aspects, why providers shy away from the conversation about diet as a therapy. There are many reasons, but I think one of them is just the overwhelm of there's no standard of care, of how to treat this as a therapy. So that's something I'm very passionate about. And as I mentor colleagues or as I've worked with other programs to develop their nutrition programs, we talk about this a lot. And it can look different between each practice, just as each GI provider's practice may be a little bit different as far as what they're monitoring, but more or less it'll be similar. It's important to have a defined starting point. This is when we're transitioning to the diet. This is what it can look like. But, within a month, we should be on the full SCD, or we should be on the Crohn's disease exclusion diet, or wherever we're going. If we're using diet as a therapy, a defined starting point and a defined endpoint. We're going to look at it for 3 months. These are the objective markers we're looking at, your CBC, your inflammatory markers, your CMP, and these stool tests, for example. And we'll do this again at a certain interval, at week 4 and at week 12, for example. And then from there, what's the maintenance plan? We have a discussion of these are options of what we can look at, but this is kind of our conversation is starting. We want a minimum kind of 3 months to really evaluate. This is what we would expect to see kind of at month 1, where we'd hope you'd be at. If we're not seeing this, then we reevaluate. It's so important to have that conversation, just like you would with starting a new medication, because we need to ensure that ultimately the treatment regimen, whether it's diet, meds, or both, is treating the inflammation, right? Because long-term, that's what matters. So that's kind of the conversation I have, and I'll outline that for them, patients in a roadmap, and I'll send that to their GI provider who's thinking, who's this crazy dietitian, talking about diet therapy, because like I said, it's not widely incorporated in practice all around. So it's very kind of a nuance. There are not a ton of IBD dietitians in general, let alone many who will use nutrition therapy as part of their protocol.
No, it is unfortunate we don't have more folks that are very specific about their choice in career and become IBD specific dietitians. We'd like to see more.
Yes, we've had several of them on the show, so it's an exciting time. There are efforts being made to train, and ultimately, I think, an IBD dietitian will be a specialty, just like a certified diabetes educator, for example.
I think there's other disease states that have really gotten it right and have a model for how we do this. And so this just makes sense. It makes sense for this to be part of how we treat people living with IBD. You started out as a pediatric dietitian. Now that you have moved to private practice, you see adults as well. Who do you like better?
That's tough, honestly. My training, I'll always be, I love that nutrition heals and that it promotes growth. Right. So we know like one of the major differences between an adult and pediatrics is kids have to grow and they need to get through puberty. So I think I'm very passionate about that aspect of pediatrics. But I have loved working with adults, and it's a whole new world, because when I was working at Seattle Children's Hospital with pediatrics, we have the multidisciplinary team, you have access to all these people. And now that I'm in private practice, I see folks from all over the country who have never even heard of an IBD dietitian or don't have that option at all at their center or in their state, so I'm very passionate about this. I feel all patients should have access to individualized nutrition counseling, because IBD is so specific to them, each individual. And it changes depending on the patient's journey, whether they go through surgery, whether they have a flare and they're malnourished. And just having that partnership of someone who can coach you to take all that pressure off is huge. And I see that a lot more in adults. Kids are it's more for the parents, especially if they're young, like under 11, let's say, they're not as involved in their cooking and their food. They still play an important role in decision-making, but it's up to the parents. And with adults, a lot of times they're just coming to me. They're like, this is what I want. And we can really hit the ground running. So I don't know if I can say I have a favorite.
It's a very political response. I know. That's only partially snarky, because I would imagine there's just differences in how you work with them. And it's got to be kind of fun to work with kids in some way, just because they're so curious and in some cases unshaped, and so you get a chance to kind of help them build a relationship with food.
You said something so important, Alicia, and I don't want to miss it. It's kind of like the concept of kids being a fresh slate. If you're with them when they're diagnosed, you can clear up so much confusion and, tangents in life that they may take from a nutrition standpoint. And I think that's the beauty of something why I want patients to have this so much is just the noise that they find online and the rabbit trails they can go down that can be really, really harmful. Or this social media influencer said this supplement will cure, or my food sensitivity test, or, this cleanse. And we can prevent so much of that meeting with the dietitian from the beginning. So that's why I was like, I'm meeting with every family, even if they don't want to see me, I'm at least showing my face so they know I'm here for questions when that colonic cleanse comes up and they're considering it for their child. So the blank slate of kids is really true. And also as they feel better, if they can feel better quickly, they can go back to their regular diet so quickly. It's like without skipping a beat. A lot of the times that's like generally speaking, right? We know there are kids that will have disordered eating challenges, or we know almost all individuals, or it's very commonplace for those with IBD to have maladaptive tendencies around food, right? Because I eat and then I have symptoms. But once their inflammation is treated, they generally can go back so quickly to their diet and then we hit the ground running. This is perfect. Don't even focus on the past. We're just moving forward with questions that they may have, or how can I be out with my friends? And we can really focus on like setting them up long-term for what can a healthy diet look like to support my body, to support my IBD, those conversations.
I'm just thinking about the time that a lady told me that this Blue Frog energy drink was going to cure me because it cured her son. That's all.
Did you try it, Robin?
No, I did not try it because fortunately for me, I already knew that was not true.
Good. How'd you know that this was not true?
How did I know that?
I feel like some of these things can at times be so tempting. Energy drink, maybe, but some of them can sound so enticing.
She was so persuasive. I think maybe it was because when she got mad at me when I told her that I wasn't going to do it, I think that's when I was like, I don't think this is going to work.
We part ways here.
Yeah.
You bring up a really good point. And Kim, you asking the question, but how did you know? How do you help coach people to find the right data when they are being provided with crappy information on a pretty regular basis?
I say well-intending aunts and uncles, friends, family that give the wrong advice.
Or like you said, the influencer people, like that's really difficult, especially when you're a teenager and you're still like developing your frontal cortex and making decisions. Like that's really powerful. So
yes.
It's got to be a hard one.
And peers, I would see, body image, especially as we were getting in adolescence, it can be so hard, just the peer pressure males and females have, like just drink, like you're saying, Robin, those energy drinks. That's like I said, I asked genuinely, how did you know? Because many kids would be like, oh, that's what I need to keep my energy up, to feel well, to be able to do the sports I want to do. I remember one patient seeing a kid who had been on protein supplement and labs were being impacted by it. And this individual had Crohn's disease and came in and we had a whole conversation on, when did you start drinking these shakes? Let's look at what's in them and see, what ingredient do you recognize these ingredients? How much protein? Are they nutritionally complete? What does that mean? So at the adolescent stage, I really like that age as well, because kids are making a lot more of their own food choices. So sometimes parents will let them talk to you on their own because they're not going to listen to their parents half the time, right? It's like the independence phase. And we can really dig into food labels or what will really give you the energy you need to do your weightlifting or to feel better in your body. So we can have a lot more of those conversations when I know what they've been introduced to, whether it's a certain supplement shake, for example.
I would love for you to talk about Eats for IBD because this is a subscription platform, but you also provide a lot of free resources. I would like for you to share more about the platform that you built with Maddie.
So Eats for IBD is the brainchild of Maddie's experiences living with Crohn's disease and kind of my lack of resources, 10 years ago when I was using this in practice. It was like, okay, this diet, we don't have a lot of evidence. We're trying to do the research. How do we pull together resources to give families recipes, what they need? Maddie and I met through Seattle Children's as she came as a patient and I was able to meet with her, and she was using nutrition therapy as part of her disease management. So she came up to Seattle to meet with one of the GI providers and myself. And from there, we just developed a deep, deep friendship. Now, that was when she was a young teenager. So that was like 10 years ago. And she started writing recipes, and her parents, the way they kind of gave her autonomy and allowed her to have some control in, when there's such a lack of control in IBD, was to make food for the family. So she just started writing all of her recipes down. I had my own recipes. Fast forward, several years, we started doing this more formally and decided that we wanted to create a cookbook. So the cookbook totally blew up into something a lot bigger as we got going, and Eats happened. So it's as of now, a platform, kind of first of its kind, evidence-based nutrition platform that supports those with IBD and their families with recipes, meal planning support, culinary resources. So for those, that are wanting to say, okay, I want to decrease processed foods, or I want to learn how to cook more in the kitchen, it's absolutely for them. It's also tailored to these nutrition therapies as well. So you can filter by diet therapy, Mediterranean, texture modifications, for periods of feeling unwell, or if there's other complications of IBDs, we have certain like icons they can filter by. So it's created purely for those with IBD. We have icons that, promote prebiotics, or if a recipe has probiotics, they can select those. And then certain nutrients that we know those with IBD may be more prone to, we also highlight kind of recipes that include those nutrients in them. And then I think part of the best piece of this is it's all within the context of a supportive community where we offer, guides that they may need. Like we'll create something, for example, like time-saving strategies in the kitchen, or, how to save your energy and decrease time spent, because a lot of these nutrition therapies take so much time. If you're making new foods, or if a kid's like, hey, I don't like what you made, and recreating recipes. We also provide live events that we try and share, when we can, with the world as a whole. And people can hop on and say, I'm having trouble with meal planning. We're doing one this month, for example, on meal prep and meal planning strategies, where people can share, we have ideas and people can share their experiences and what's worked for them, so other people can get ideas. It's also fills a huge void in my practice that, like I said, I wished I had 10 years ago. As those that I see, I can provide them, like it complements the teaching points that I touch on in practice. So they have a resource to go to see, okay, this is what Kim was talking about. I know what recipes I'm filtering for. I know how to do my meal plan for me, for example. So it's really changed my practice and what I can give patients.
That's so cool. And I love that Maddie's parents sort of gave her like the reins and said, fine, you do this and make this something that you really love and enjoy. And that's so awesome. What a great community that you're building there. How many folks engage in that, or just curious about your membership?
So it's literally launched like this fall, winter. And so it's growing, but we haven't done a ton of marketing at this point because it's been like, our call it the passion project of the nights and weekends. And right now it's a lot of my patients. And so we're hoping to spread the word out there, but time.
Yeah. It will be linked in the show notes for folks that are looking for it. So definitely go check it out. So if you're looking for it, make sure you go down to our show notes. So that's fantastic.
Yes, I'll share other resources on there too.
Amazing. Yeah. Your website is really great. I mean, it has a lot of information. It's very colorful and enjoyable to actually spend time on. So I always love that. Robin, our new website is also amazing and colorful and is fun to spend time on, just as a note.
Yes, I do like that. Your guys' new website too.
In your work with all of like NASPGHAN and some of these different sort of agencies that are within your space, one thing I'm always curious about is in what way are you looking at health equity and access as we're looking at some of these diet studies? Because again, when we're talking about some of these diets studies, it's using something like almond flour, which almond flour is expensive, or looking at people that are living in sort of food deserts where really you don't have a lot of fresh options. So how is that being looked at?
Nutrition therapies as they stand right now, right, have been looked at in the population that they've been researched. So the CDED has come out of Israel. They have partnered with, institutions in Canada and some now in the US. So we've expanded to see, okay, if this diet is working in the Israeli population, can it work in these other populations? As we look through these nutrition therapies, I think we need to do a better job. And that's like a whole other avenue of research through the lens of social determinants of health. Can certain people do them? Certain groups, do they have the means to learn to make new foods? And would they be interested? Are they the same disparities and struggles we're seeing, with medication adherence, compliance, and access? And I think some of that may be yes, and I'm definitely not the expert here, but I do think for those groups that nutrition therapy may not be as accessible, sometimes the option of EEN, especially in pediatrics, can be covered more often than it is in adults. We've talked about coverage of these therapies, right? We know that medications, it's a beast to get coverage for those at times, but there's no coverage really for nutrition therapies, right? And grocery shopping. And almond flour is not a common food, right? And it totally is expensive. So I think with some of the newer options that are coming out, like the CDED, for example, they did try and use more traditional traditional, typical foods that kids want to eat day to day because it started in pediatrics. So if they're done under guidance, there is a way to make these more affordable, and to, with a planned grocery list and planned meals. But that takes a whole level of being able to do that, to be able to plan and cook and incorporate this into your week. So at this point, I don't think, as I mentioned, like those 4 aspects that I'm really looking at, one of those big ones is it accessible to a family? Do they have the means to do this? And it's okay if they don't. They'll still get, whether when it was in the clinical setting, they would still get the education that they wanted, or they felt that they could do at the time. And then, sometimes it changes. So I still present them all the information and they still have the means to decide what, I think that piece of shared decision making between the patient and provider is so important. Here are your options. What feels right to you and your family? This is what the research shows. Here's medication. Here's diet. And I don't think that's a conversation. The diet piece is not, like I said, a common discussion point right now. Still, it's changing, but we're still not quite there. So don't know if that answers the question, but
it does. And, we just talked to Kim Beal, and she was talking about the resources that Nutrition Therapy for IBD provide to not just patients, but also to providers so that they're having a more comfortable conversation. They feel more confident bringing this up with patients. So I think that's so exciting. So yeah, I hope that this is starting to turn the tide, that people feel much more comfortable bringing this up.
It's such a big struggle and a can of worms for providers because there are so many nuanced questions that come up with diet, and they don't have time or the training, and should they be the ones responsible for presenting all the nutrition information? They have so many other things to be thinking of and working through to advocate for their patients. The resources we've worked through and the teams working through Nutrition Therapy for IBD, the goal is truly an option for every patient. And there is, like, we've talked a lot more about nutrition therapies and kind of my experience and expertise in that realm, but diet is absolutely for everyone with IBD at any stage of their journey.
Okay, here's my curveball question for you before we get to the last one.
Great.
What is the most underrated food? What is a food where you're like, everybody should be eating more of a category specific food? You can even give me 5 if you're feeling real spicy.
Yeah. Well, I think of like foods that people will actually eat. When I think of like bang for your buck nutrient density, if people would eat liver and sardines, oh man, we could fix a lot of nutrient deficiencies. That's not an option, for sure. But I think using and implementing nutrition therapies, you have to be pretty creative at times. And the most underrated and I think underused, maybe more in our culture, in the United States, is lentils, legumes in general, and legume flours. In Indian culture, they do a great job of including those in their cooking, but we don't. And they're super nutritious, nutrient dense. We use a lot of those ingredients in Eats for IBD, and they can give the consistency more of wheat. So they're also loaded with, different B vitamins. So for those that can't do a lot of meat, they're a great option. And we can generally find a way to modify their texture that people will tolerate. One of my number one, and they add fiber. A lot of those with IBD are like, I cannot tolerate a bean to save my life. So that's where we can get creative with the flours or changing the texture sometimes and starting small to see if we can find a way to kind of bring them into one's life to spice things up. Robin, do you have any thoughts on beans?
I am from Louisiana. We eat some beans.
Yes, you do.
I love me some beans. As a matter of fact, the year of my life that I went down to 5 foods, beans was one of those foods.
No way.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you put beans in there.
It was bland chicken, beans, rice, and an avocado. And I would spice it up with some lemon or lime juice. And that was pretty much the only foods that didn't hurt me.
And there you go. That's where IBD is so individualized, because so many would be like, I can't tolerate a bean. Or many patients that I've seen over the years with a pouch will say, no, I can't do beans in any form. So individualized.
I think that's probably because I grew up on beans. I mean,
you had the bugs to support their digestion. Native.
Kim, it has been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. But now, unfortunately, it is time for me to ask you the last question. So what is the one thing you want the IBD community to know? Or maybe since you're a peds RD, what is the one thing you want providers, parents, or patients? All 3, or just pick one. It's up to you. We're giving you all the options, Kim.
Well, I have something for all of them. So for providers, we know that, as we've talked about, that one of the top questions patients ask is, what should I be eating? And not everyone has an IBD specialized dietitian in their practice or feels comfortable and has the time to discuss the nuances of diet and IBD. But for providers, you can provide your patients with reliable resources where they can learn more about diet and IBD. So maybe you don't have the answers, but you can point them to reliable resources that do exist now. So we'll include those resources on the show in the comments. And that's the most important. So you don't have to have all the answers, but point your patients to a place where they can find reliable, safe answers. For providers, knowing the evidence behind nutrition therapies and best fit patients allows you to present all the therapeutic options that would include meds and diet to a patient for shared decision making about the best plan for them moving forward. And I think this is so important. You don't have to know the nuances of the nutrition therapy, but knowing the evidence, while it's more limited than we'd like, it's growing to support some of these therapies, and they could be a great option at times for your patient. So also being able to point them to those resources that we'll share. For patients, and maybe patients and parents, if you have the means to meet with an IBD specialized dietitian, do it. If you do not have the means, be the squeaky wheel and don't stop asking your care team to get an IBD dietitian in your GI practice.
Be the squeaky wheel.
Yep. That's the only way change happens. It comes from patients.
Yeah.
The main way, especially when we have a lack of funding.
The SCD study is a great example of that. Like you said, that was driven by patients coming and
Yep.
saying, hey, this is a thing. And then other people saying, well, maybe we should make sure it's a thing.
And
That's a great example.
And having providers that listened, right? That said, okay, well, we're going to get our own funding to support our research.
And
who's
that's
going to fund this?
Exactly. And that's the difficulty with, I think a lot of people don't know, is that's the difficulty with research for diet studies, is that it's different pools of money, that a lot of times money comes from pharmaceutical companies, and they're not going to make any money on a diet.
You're not going to make any money. And we know diet studies are so hard to do, right? It's so hard to
Yes.
see a causation study versus an association. And to get the numbers, we really need the high powered studies. So that's all very real. But when you use it in practice and you do see the impacts, you know it works for some and not all.
It's also hard for people to stay on a diet for a study. Are you providing the food for them? You're giving them money and they're getting their own
Yes.
food. Who's preparing the food? Is it being prepared the same way? Like there's so many considerations for a diet study.
So many things. We've done them all.
Like whenever everyone's like, oh, we should study diet more. It's so much harder to study diet, people.
hard.
It's so much harder to study
And
diet.
food works in synergy, right? So it's so hard to piece out, as we get to that. And this is what I love blogging about, the nuanced details of like dairy and IBD or gluten, because we get that so much in practice. But to parcel out, okay, gluten in the sourdough, is that the same as gluten in store-bought bread? Or is all dairy created equal? No, in my mind, no. Dairy is a huge group, and it's hard we can't piece those out in a study, like looking at, let's just put all of them on cow's milk. That would be a terrible idea. So they're hard to do. And you also bring in different populations. So kind of talking more about your question about the health disparities in different populations, we found that when we provided patients with chef prepared meals, it brought in a different socioeconomic group than families who are in a study making their own food. And it made it harder if you don't know how to cook, or you're bringing in chef prepared food to a kid who is used to eating a certain way at home. It made adherence really hard, and then sustainability long-term really hard because the parent didn't necessarily know how to cook foods on the SCD. So it was really interesting to see kind of the different populations, the different study designs would bring in.
Yeah, that's so interesting because, you're right. If they're getting chef prepared food, you're able to more reliably ensure what's going into the food and how the food is prepared, but then you're not teaching the family how to make the food to make it a sustainable diet.
Unless you're doing it, it doesn't stick. So even if we educated the parents, on how to do it, other than like, I would always tell families, if I could go with you and cook for you and shop for you, I would. Like, I would love to, take that piece off for you. But unless they're doing it for a study or really having to implement it themselves, it's not the focus, which makes sense. Ultimately, with nutrition therapy, the goal, we want to see least restriction with the maximum benefit, right? And a therapy has to work from a quality of life standpoint. It has to treat symptoms and inflammation. And most have an option. Most of the more rigorous upfront, like the SCD or the AIP, for example, have an option of expanding. And that's what we work to, especially with kids.
Kim, obviously we could continue talking to you and continue. It has been honestly such a joy to talk to
Yes.
you, and so excited for people to have you as a resource now that you're in private practice and be able to get kind of your knowledge at their fingertips, hopefully, and be able to work with you. So thank you so much for what you do. Thank you, everybody else, for joining us on the show. And cheers. I still have drink left. Cheers.
Cheers. Cheers, everybody.
Hi, this is Kim Brawley. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, subscribe, and share it with your friends.